Good afternoon and welcome to the ALS Canada webinar. Today is Global ALS MND Awareness Day, and it's an important day in our calendars as we acknowledge the contribution that is being made around the world by organizations, clinicians, researchers, industry, and people affected by ALS. Today, we are united together to create a world free of ALS MND. ALS Canada has an important role in this effort as a convener, a facilitator, contributor, and a provider of support. On a global level, ALS Canada is a significant contributor to the International Alliance of ALS MND Associations. That's over 50 organizations that are collectively working together to share resources to support people actively living with ALS, to coordinate information on research and therapeutic developments, and address needs in underserved countries as we coordinate pathways to therapeutic treatments. In Canada, the National Research Program is a unique aspect of ALS Canada's mission. We are making critical investments in cutting-edge research and building research and clinical capacity across the country. We're investing in things like Refer ALS, a tool that is helping to make sure that we have a way of addressing earlier diagnosis. On a pan-Canadian level, we are advocating for access to therapies, working with industry, the federal and provincial governments, the healthcare systems, and payers to ensure that all Canadians have equitable and timely access, and making sure decision makers are well informed by people affected by ALS. Within Ontario, ALS Canada has a similar role to the provincial societies, helping people within the province to navigate their journey with ALS. We are providing direct community services one-to-one, connecting with people in their homes, providing virtual support groups, connection to community resources, and the necessary mobility and home care equipment so that people will have what they need as their disease progresses. And just as we are here today, ALS Canada is a go-to source for trusted information and programming on all things ALS. Initiatives such as the Canadian ALS Learning Institute help to ensure community advocates are well informed and empowered as they bring forth the voices of lived experience to inform government consultation, industry, and research trials and programming. It is also important to note that the work we do and the contribution that we make in all aspects of ALS is completely funded by the generosity of donors. We are so very grateful for their support and dedication to the cause and to the ALS Society of Canada. With your help, we can create a future without ALS. So today, as well as being Global ALS MND Awareness Day, it is also National Indigenous Peoples Day. And I would like to share a land acknowledgement with your help, and a few words about our commitment. At the ALS Society of Canada, we are continuing our learning and the work of addressing inclusivity, diversity, equity, and accessibility, or as we like to call it, IDEA. We are taking the opportunity to understand and consider how these issues and opportunity for change reflect in our culture for our staff and our volunteers, in the work we do to support the ALS community we serve, in the research we invest in, and on our collaboration within the healthcare system and with partners in industry, and how, as an organization, we can demonstrate leadership to address systemic issues. Today, as we come together for this national webinar, I am speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat people. We also acknowledge that this territory is covered by Treaty 13. In the spirit of reconciliation, we honor and acknowledge the enduring presence of Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people. We are grateful to have the opportunity to come together on this land, and we thank you for being a part of today's event. So now, I'm going to introduce you to two people who are representing the leadership of CALS, the network of multidisciplinary clinics across Canada. Today, we will be joined by Dr. Jean-Pierre Matt, Assistant Professor, Department of Neurosciences and Faculty of Medicine at Université de Montréal, and leads the ALS clinic at the CRCHUM, as she is past chair of CALS and one of our national leaders in running clinical trials for ALS. Our other presenter today will be Dr. Kristen Shoesmith, Associate Professor of Neurology at Western University in London, Ontario, and the Director of the Motor Neuron Diseases Clinic at the London Health Sciences Centre since 2010, as well as the Neuromuscular Disease and EMG clinics. She is also a national leader in clinical trials for ALS and is the current chair of the CALS network. And a person who needs no introduction, Dr. David Taylor, VP of Research and Strategic Relationships at ALS. Over to you, Dave.
Okay, I'm gonna get going here. So, hello everyone. I have the unenviable task of trying to put down the foundation for our great Q&A that's coming soon around the ALS treatments and clinical trial pipeline in a very short period of time. So please consider this sort of movie trailer. There's a lot more information out there. Some of this is going to go by. It's to stimulate questions and kind of give you an idea of a few aspects. Sometimes you'll get these short talks and there'll be cherry-picked therapies that people will talk about. Today we're going to kind of take it up a little bit to a higher level from there. So the number one thing when I have a short talk I really like to tell people is you're not alone. Know that we are here for you. If you have any questions about any of this, you can email at research@als.ca. What you'll see off to the right, this thing called office hours, this is the thing we're collaborating on to help support elsewhere. We're looking, it's just an example of a touch point where people can ask questions on a regular basis, so no one has to wait too long. And we're looking into what would be the most effective way in Canada to be able to do this as well. So just so you know, some of this goes quickly. It's a lot to digest, this whole pipeline of what's happening in clinical trials and treatments. We are always here for you to help you navigate a difficult environment. And again, ALS clinical trials and data are complex. There is a lot of things, a lot of questions that can come up. And, you know, I'm not a mechanic. I can do certain things with cars, but I do have to go to a mechanic to get certain things done with my car. And ALS is even more complex, obviously, than fixing a car. But when we think about that, it's the same thing. You're not expected to know everything. You're not expected to learn all this on your own. So please do reach out and we can help. One of the things I love to be able to say in something like this, and I have a talk on this called Media versus Data, is to be very cautious of what you read through media sources or through company press releases. Those are often very positive in certain ways for many reasons. And we're happy to be able to help nuance some of that information, or to be able to confirm it in situations where it's very accurate. But just always do know that we are here. Now, there's so much that we could talk about, and this is why you're seeing why I talked about it being a quick overview. This is from our Canadian ALS Learning Institute. It's one of the presentations on clinical trial design. Hopefully it doesn't scare anyone out from applying to that amazing program. But just to let you know that there are so many different things we could talk about. I think it could be a whole university course. And so again, noting that if you do have questions, we can certainly get you the answers. One other thing I wanted to really highlight at the start is that, you know, as Canadians, we often look south of the border and we think, you know, we don't have all the things that they have, whether it's funding or clinical trial access, et cetera. But I really wanted to highlight, and you're going to get to obviously hear from two of the key people in the CALS network, which is the clinicians across Canada who are really plugged into the global effort, are working incredibly hard to bring the best clinical trials and experimental therapeutic access here in Canada, and really do work closely with ALS Canada and together across the country to try to improve access across this country in a more equitable fashion. And we can talk about that in a little bit as well. So, you know, what is ALS is one of the questions that I think is important when it comes to clinical trials and about looking at treatments. And I think obviously many of the people on this call will know what it is, but if we think about our body in terms of little tiny compartments that make up all the tissues of our body called cells, they all look different. They all have different functions for each of the different organs of the body. And in the case of our brain and our spinal cord, we have these living wires called neurons. And in particular, in ALS, the wires are called motor neurons, and they are designed to connect our brains to our muscles, our brain to our muscles, to cause them to contract. And in ALS, these degenerate and die, and that ultimately means your brain can't signal those muscle cells to contract, and this is what causes the progressive paralysis of the disease. We have an upper motor neuron that's in our brain, goes down to our spinal cord, and then that lower motor neuron will connect to those muscle cells. This is sort of a cartoon of what it looks like, but it's not just the motor neurons that are involved in the process, it's actually other cell types around it as well. And so treatments are often focused at not only trying to help what's happening within the motor neuron, but also the cells that are surrounding it. So if we look at this in a different way, there are many different ways in which we can look at potential treatments for ALS. One of them is to be able to go inside the cell itself, the motor neuron, and try to understand what's going wrong and fix that. And another one is to try to make a better environment for them to survive in. So thinking about a car again, if your car is breaking down, you can fix your car, but it's also really hard to run a car that's not breaking down when you're in minus 40-degree weather. And so this is sort of the situation in ALS. You can make the surroundings better, which is what a lot of the targeting is done. And it's also something we want to do is to look at the internal mechanisms of the motor neuron and try to understand how we can restore the proper functioning of those motor neurons to give back their function. So how are clinical trials being studied, or what is being studied in clinical trials in 2023? And this is obviously a really big amount of things, which is actually a great message. And, you know, when I started at ALS Canada back in 2012, there were probably 5 to 10 companies total that were invested in developing therapies for ALS. Now it's over 100. And that's a really a great testament to what we've learned in the past 10 years in terms of that understanding of what's happening in the disease, that all of these companies are willing to put forward funds and development to try to get to a therapy that can be marketed and help to treat people living with ALS. And they wouldn't be invested in the ALS field if we didn't have that understanding for potential targets for treatment. So that, I think, into itself is a really exciting thing. Now, if I kind of think about where are we trying to go with clinical trials, and in terms of experimental therapeutics, I think if we could really advance things, there are kind of two big things that I call the 1-2 punch. The first one is, can we get scientifically valid treatment targets? So really, rather than just looking at things that sort of may stop what we think might be working in a broader stroke. So I'll give you an example. In ALS, we know that there are inflammatory mechanisms that are happening around the motor neuron. And there are a lot of therapies we've tried that are sort of generically dampening an inflammatory response, but they're not ALS specific therapies. They're not designed from ALS specific learnings in the lab, and a lot of those had failed. So over time, what we want to do is have more scientifically valid ALS specific treatments. And something like cystic fibrosis is a really great example of a disease where for decades, there were sort of generic treatments that were having a modest effect, and over time, they've had much more substantial effect on people living with CF once we've learned about what the science is that's happening and being able to actually target and correct those defects. The second thing is clinical trial design, and it's something we've been working on in the field for a long time, definitely focused on for about a decade, but really things have changed in the past few years in terms of getting to faster, more reliable answers for ALS clinical trials. Now, when I talk about the scientifically valid clinical trials, you know, I think one of the great things about where we are in 2023 is we're now starting to see treatments come into clinical trials that are based around some very interesting research at the laboratory level for ALS. And it's really important, I've highlighted it here, that we still don't know if any of these work, but these are some of the things that, and this is only a partial list, things where you would have scientists in ALS that would say, you know, I'm kind of interested in what will happen there. I think this at the very least, we're going to learn a lot from this particular clinical trial. So I think that's a really exciting thing. And an analogy sometimes that I use on this is that, you know, if you have organized crime in a city, and if your motor neuron and all the things that are going wrong before a motor neuron degenerates is like having a crime-ridden city, you know, a lot of what we've been targeting is down here, sort of petty crime, where if you're able to stop one of these things, you might have a modest effect in one area of the city, but you're not going to be able to completely solve what's happening. As we start to get up to things that are more scientifically valid specifically for ALS, and we don't know for sure if some of these things will work, but we're hopeful that these will actually have a more substantial effect because they will cut off some of those downstream mechanisms and ultimately provide better hope. And at the end of the day, what we really want to get to, so some of these generic treatments are kind of also like having a dam where you may be putting your finger or your toe in one hole, but there's still a lot of different things happening. And what we ultimately want to get to is what are those initial triggers, and can we treat people early enough with ALS so that we can have a substantial effect on all of the downstream mechanisms from that initial trigger. So one of the ways in which we're starting to look scientifically at what might be some of those initial triggers is genetic therapies for ALS. This obviously won't affect everyone, but it does help us to get to something that we think in the next few years or the next several years, we may have some substantial potential therapies that could have great effects. And I won't go into any of these in detail because then I'll be going for about an hour or two because I love talking about them and I get very nerdy about it. But again, just to say that it's important that we start looking at the actual looking for those initial triggers if we want to think about having a really substantial effect on slowing progression of the disease. So in terms of clinical trial design, one of the things we can do to make trials more scientific is adding biomarkers. And I thought I would just put an example here of how biomarkers can actually make our trials more scientific and more rigorous moving forward. Now, there are a lot of things in clinical trial design that we can do that will improve things in the future. You know, we're talking about platform trials, which can speed up our ability to see what's good and what's not. You know, our outcome measures of how we read trials are really important. And I think biomarkers are something you're going to hear a lot about. So I thought I would just highlight in today's webinar a couple of things to show you how they can be really powerful. So the first one is something called a pharmacodynamic or target engagement biomarker. And I call this the just do your job biomarkers. And that is that it's really important for us to be able to say, if we're going to treat someone with something, we have to know that it's doing what it's supposed to do in people. And there are a couple examples that have done a decent job at this. I'll focus particularly on tofersen or Qalsody by Biogen, which was a therapy that was designed to reduce the levels of a protein called SOD1. And ultimately, they were able to show that. And so what it means is that if the trial hadn't worked, we would know why. We would know that we wouldn't want to continue to pursue reducing that SOD1 protein as a particular therapeutic. Or if it does work and it looks like it's working, this helps us to understand and think, yes, it really must be working through the mechanism that it's supposed to, because we saw that it was actually doing what it was supposed to do in the body. The second one is something called a surrogate endpoint or surrogate biomarker, and you might see some of this as well when you read about ALS therapies. And this one is kind of a did it work biomarker, and we're trying to find better ones of these for sure. But one of the ones you might hear about is called neurofilament, and this is a way of being able to say biologically, can we see a signal that potentially neurons are being preserved, which can help us to understand not only by looking at the clinical effects of the drug or the therapy, does it slow the progression of the disease, but at the same time, is there a biological signal that tells us perhaps that less neurons are dying? And so this is one of the ones that is currently being looked at and can certainly be more powerful in the future if we can continue to work to see if that will be a good outcome or a good readout. Another one is called a prognostic biomarker. And so one of the things about ALS is it's very different from person to person, and it's really hard for us to assess at the outset of a clinical trial how each person will progress. And you can imagine that if you have someone on a treatment and someone on a placebo and they progress at different rates, it's really hard to be able to tell if that treatment is working. So this is the ones that call the, okay, I can see where this is going biomarkers. So ultimately what we want to be able to do is find things that can tell us whether we're comparing apples to apples or apples to oranges in terms of the progression rate. So if we can be sure that we're treating someone with a placebo group and a treatment group with a therapy, and we know that they're they're going to progress at approximately the same rate, we can get a really good readout as to whether or not that particular therapy is having an effect. And finally, a predictive biomarker is something we'd love to be able to get to as well, which would be helping to tell us whether or not a particular group might be a responder to that therapy in sort of a personalized medicine way. And we are hoping to eventually get to that as well. And there are examples of trials where only a certain subset of people are being recruited because it is hoped that those might be potential responders for the trial. Now, bringing this all together, that can be a little complicated. I thought I would use just a quick example to show you how powerful this can be. So let's say we have a fake treatment called Treaterol, and it reduces the levels of some fake protein called EVIL. And we want to measure an ALS clinical trial where people are progressing at a certain rate. We want to see if after a year, perhaps they slow the progression of the disease. Or perhaps the readout shows that nothing changed for those individuals who were treated with Treaterol versus a placebo. Now, if we didn't have any accompanying biomarkers, we don't know why Treaterol didn't work in this case, or why it did work, because we didn't actually measure, for example, the levels of the EVIL protein. But if we put in the just do your job biomarkers, we could actually be able to see for the first time whether or not the EVIL protein is reduced. And if we do see that it doesn't work and the EVIL protein was reduced, then we can start to say, okay, now we don't need to pursue reducing the EVIL protein anymore in ALS because we know doing that didn't actually help. Let's say we have a surrogate biomarker, so maybe we didn't see any effect clinically, but we did see that there was a preservation in neuronal health. And then we say, well, maybe we need to look in a different way, or we need to look at a longer trial to be able to give time for that to actually read out clinically. A prognostic biomarker is important because maybe the two groups weren't actually going to move at the same pace, and maybe we actually missed a signal when it didn't work because we ended up having people on the placebo who were perhaps moving at a faster rate than those who were on the treatment. And then those things started to balance out because we weren't looking at people who were ultimately going to progress at the same rate in the two groups. And finally, a predictive biomarker is where we'd love to get to. Maybe only people who have a mutation in the EVIL gene that produces the EVIL protein would actually respond to this. And if we can get to trials with all of these different biomarkers approach, it's more scientific, we get stronger answers, and ultimately we can learn more to make treatments come faster and be more effective for ALS. It's really important for us to be able to do that by participating in observational trials. So we know that disease intervention trials, ones with experimental therapeutics to slow down progression of the disease, are the ones that most people want to participate in, but we absolutely can't get to better treatments and to a time of personalized medicine if we're not getting help to better understand people with ALS. We study mice, fish, rats, worms, and cells in the lab all the time, but people are very different in how they progress with ALS and how they present. And so we do urge people to help us by telling their biological story. And we do have a great initiative here in Canada called Capture ALS, which is designed to really help to understand why an individual has ALS and why their ALS presents in a certain way, so that we can get to these days where we'll have better clinical trials, better treatments, and more personalized medicine. In the last few minutes, and I know that was a very fast overview, we can certainly talk about any of those other things at any time you'd like, are around the approved treatments for ALS. And I will be going through these quite quickly, but we'll certainly talk about them in the discussion after. The first one is Riluzole. This is the time-tested treatment for ALS. It has a pretty good, what we call real-world evidence over many years that says for some people it is able to extend the lifespan. And more recent evidence has shown that it might be for some people even more beneficial than we had always kind of talked about. We don't really know the mechanism of action. It is surmised and something that we haven't ever really confirmed very well. But again, we do know that this is something that for some people certainly has a time-tested effect. And it is prescribed widely around the world at this time. Radicava or Darvone from Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma is something that was approved as an intravenous therapy in 2018. It is an oral therapy approved by Health Canada as of last year. The IV form is available more widely as well as in many different countries. And this is based around a clinical trial that slowed progression of disease by about 33% in a group of people in the trial. And so I will say that this is still being studied, and you know, hopefully with those studies we'll get more confirmatory evidence. It's possible that we'll be able to see it's effective for a wider group of individuals, but we need to be able to do those further studies to better understand how this can be incorporated into standard of care treatment moving forward. And similarly, Albrioza, or what was called AMX35, is also known as Relyvrio in the United States, is approved in the United States and Canada from Amylyx Pharmaceuticals, was slowing progression in a clinical trial as well by about 25%, and was able to extend lifespan by about 5 to 6 months when treated early. And so this is another one that is still being studied, and I'll actually have a slide on that just in a moment, and I am wrapping up here really quickly for my colleagues. The last one approved in the United States, tofersen, also known as Qalsody. This is specifically for people who have a mutation in a gene called SOD1 or SOD1, and it is available through a special access program in Canada, and has quite convincing data to date, with a very strong uptake from clinicians around the world through this special access program that it is available. And that actually is also still being studied. That, I just wanted to add very quickly, is being studied in a very special clinical trial where people are actually being treated or put into a clinical trial upstream of clinical symptoms of the disease, using a biomarker to be able to determine when perhaps the disease is starting before they ever get any symptoms. And I say this because I think it's really important for us to eventually be able to do this for the wider group of people living with ALS. And if we can find these kinds of ways to determine when the disease is happening early on, we might be able to actually get to treatment someday in clinical trials where we're testing people before the clinical symptoms even begin. So it's a pretty revolutionary trial that's happening. Lastly, and as I said, there are confirmatory clinical trials happening that will help us to better understand those standard of care treatments, both for edaravone and both for Radicava and for Albrioza. And you know, the hope is that these will not only confirm what is seen, but perhaps tell us even more about other groups who could be affected by this. And ultimately, all of this will help us to better understand how standard of care therapies in ALS move forward in the days ahead. So we're always learning, and there's always lots to say and lots going on. And certainly, please do ask your questions when we move over to our experts here from CALS. And so I'm going to pass it over to Tammy and stop sharing my screen, and she's going to tell you a little bit about access to those standard of care therapies.
Thank you, Dave. Let me just get my screen set up here. There we go. All right. So thank you very much, Dave. And I think it was really great to get that overview. And I think, you know, for the ALS community, I know when my cousin had been diagnosed 15 years ago, we naively thought that when a therapy had been gone through all of the pieces, that it would then be available and people would have immediate access. And in fact, that's we're finding is quite different. And so I think it's important that we understand sort of what the process is, because it can be confusing when there's a drug that's approved, as Qalsody's just been by the FDA, and yet it's not available to Canadians. Or in fact, as we've seen with other therapies that are approved even within Canada that still aren't available. So what are the processes to drug access within Canada? And this is just a very quick overview of how things move forward. Dave talked a bit about the preclinical studies when we're talking about them and other mechanisms like mice and worms and cells. And then as the drug is showing some efficacy, we're moving it into clinical trials. And so in the first phase of clinical trials, they're looking at safety and then efficacy as we move forward and thinking about the dosing. Now, this moves it from research and then into a place where a company might be more interested. Once it's showing that efficacy, then we're moving it into a regulatory review. And that's where organizations like Health Canada look at it and say, is this safe? Is it meeting the endpoints? Is it doing what we thought it was going to do? And that process within Canada can take a number of months and up to a year. So if a drug is granted a priority review, we're talking about 6 months. If it's not granted a priority review, then it's a defined 300 days. But at least in that sense, we understand in that process exactly how long it's going to take and whether or not it will be approved as a notice of compliance, a notice of compliance with conditions, or in fact, not given a notice of compliance. Then there's a number of steps, and I think this is where it gets very confusing from the standpoint of what happens then. So in theory, a drug could be available as soon as it's gone through Health Canada approval. But in fact, then there are a number of considerations that have to go into it. One, pricing is often set, and that's through a mechanism that is a Patent Medicines Prices Review Board. So for patented drugs, they establish pricing, and that has to be negotiated. And then there's a further piece, which is the Canadian Drug and Technology Assessment that governs all of Canada except for Quebec. In Quebec, it's something called INAS, and they're looking at what's called a common drug review. So essentially, they're trying to assess what is the improvement for the value of the drug and trying to establish pricing that would go along beside that. That can take a period of time, and it's never quite clear how long that's going to be. And it becomes a bit of a challenge in terms of negotiating. And often what we're seeing is that CADTH is saying yes, but with clinical trial conditions that are set around it, which again, limit access for many people, especially when those are picked up further when we go into reimbursement. So once that CDR is completed, or the health technology assessment, then it goes further, and because we're wanting to be able to see drugs be available to all Canadians, it goes through pan-Canadian processes. So if you've got a private benefits package, the companies individually will be negotiating with the company that is producing the drug. And in that case, it will also be dependent upon drug plans that you may have access to, because even though you might be with a particular company like Sun Life, your drug plan may be different than another organization's drug plan that's there. But if we're looking at the public system, so that is our provincial healthcare system, when therapies are reimbursed through that, they first have to go through a pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. And this is an opportunity that all the provinces have to be able to come to one negotiating table where there are specific provinces that are identified as the organizations that will lead the negotiations, and that sets, a negotiated price. As we've seen recently, so Albrioza was approved over a year ago by Health Canada, but the PCPA negotiations took 1 year and 1 day to complete. And even still, the company now needs to go through negotiations individually with 16 different jurisdictions between the provinces, the territories, and the national formularies. So these can be long and convoluted processes. And in fact, we're very concerned because in this case, we don't have any clarity as to what the time frame is. And as we know all too well, the urgency does not meet the needs of our community in this term of this process. So this is part of what we like to share when we're talking about advocacy, because it's important to understand that it doesn't help necessarily to pound on Health Canada's door when in fact something's held up at the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance issue. There are a number of drug access pathways throughout this process. So one, people can get access if they were enrolled in a clinical trial. That's where the drug is being tested for safety and efficacy, and a person may or may not be on placebo in that. Following a clinical trial, we try to encourage companies to have an open label extension. So for anyone that went through that clinical trial, they can have access to the therapy thereafter, regardless of whether they were on placebo or not. Often that is used as an opportunity to gather real-world evidence beyond the clinical trial. A company may also decide that they're going to open up a special access program. So they may say, we have 200 placements for people with ALS to be able to access this therapy. And then it's between the clinician, the company, and the individual to be able to gain access to that. That through special access program is most often provided for free from the company, but can be a way that some parts of the population are able to get access. And then as I indicated earlier, there's private payers through private drug plans and public payers who may be putting it onto the provincial formulary. What's important through this is that there are opportunities for people to be engaged in advocacy efforts. So when we think about it, we've got formal mechanisms. So through the CADTH drug review, the common drug review, there's patient input and clinical input. ALS Canada has put in submissions for every therapy to be able to make sure that the lived experience is brought forward into the process. There is the opportunity, again, when it comes to PCPA and with the provinces, to be able to ask the provincial governments and the PCPA to make sure that they're going through the negotiations as quickly as possible. And then there's also informal ways. So making sure that we're interacting, for instance, on a regular basis with Health Canada so that they're aware of new therapies and primed for the needs of our community. And again, we're being very strong advocates when it comes to the PCPA and have had many meetings given the issues that we've seen with therapies that are stuck within the process. And then finally, we want to make sure that everyone has availability across the country. So that gives you a very quick overview. And I encourage you, if you're interested in advocating, to reach out to us at advocacy@als.ca, because it's important that the patient voice come forward and the community voice come forward through these processes. So Dave, I'm going to shoot this back over to you.
Okay, so we're going to invite Dr. Shoesmith and Dr. Matt on to the call. And so thank you. Yes, so most of that was just to set the stage for everyone out there to know that if there's information that ALS Canada can either provide it, or we have access to awesome people like we have here with us right now, and also that we're adamantly advocating on behalf and alongside the ALS community to try to have better access to therapies. So welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for your time today. There were a lot of questions that came in, and so I thought maybe the best way to start would be for both of you, if it's possible, to sort of talk about how you as neurologists approach standard of care treatments for people living with ALS, and also about access to clinical trials. So we'll start with Dr. Matt. Sorry, my apologies. Poor moderation.
Thank you, Dr. Dare. No problem. So when I first meet a patient, the neurologist really tries to confirm diagnosis if it was made elsewhere, and then try to get a full clinical picture of the patient. What's their functional status, how well or poorly they're doing, respiratory function, and also get a sense of the patient's values and objectives in their care. And with this clinical picture, we can compare it to the data available to the different drugs that are approved in Canada. So since they're approved in Canada, they're all considered standard of care. So we then present to patients what are the treatment options and show what they're expected to do, side effects, but also in the patient's context, depending on how close or how far he is from the scientific data available, what would be feasible options. And then there are unfortunately other criteria that are not within our reach: reimbursement, availability.
Dr. Shoesmith, anything to add?
Sure. So I think one of the things that is really important to do when we have these meetings with patients is that the initial meeting is sometimes quite overwhelming for the patient and their family members. And so we try to read the room a bit and decide how much information we can share in the first visit. So sometimes it's just disclosing the diagnosis and talking about the diagnosis. But if the patient is already prepared to hear that that's what the diagnosis is, then we can jump into to discuss some of the drugs that may be options for them. But as Dr. Matt was inferring, sometimes drugs are not an option based on the reimbursement criteria. So we look at duration of their symptoms, because that's often a key criteria. We look at their respiratory function, because that's often a key criteria. And sometimes we need to bring the patient back to have that testing done. So sometimes the conversation's on pause until we have all that information on hand. But one key thing that's important is that patients are often overwhelmed in the clinic, and so we will talk about a lot of things, but then a timely follow-up after that initial visit is important to make sure that they understood the conversation and that they can discuss all the options after that. So patients don't have to worry that their only time to talk about drugs is the first time. It's often the subsequent visit or even the subsequent visit after that, and often the clinic staff, like the clinic nurse or clinic coordinator, is available to that patient to have phone calls with in between, or emails if communication orally is a problem in between visits. Dr. Matt and I both are struggling with the number of new medications that we have. And so discussing 3 medications in clinic can be quite overwhelming even for us when we're trying to manage our time. And so sometimes we do pick and choose a little bit about everything, or we give written information to the patient and then do a follow-up visit afterwards. So even though this may be standard of care, there's still some time management issues that we have to pull into this as well.
Great. Thank you. So, and before I touch on the research side of things, there was a question about for someone that you may see, unfortunately, who might be past, say, 18 months or past certain cutoff times since symptom onset, how do you typically approach the conversations with those individuals? Oh, sorry, Dr. Shoesmith first. I am doing a terrible job. My apologies.
So for me first, okay.
Yes.
So you're right. There are some drugs that are an option for certain duration from onset of symptoms, and other ones that may not be an option. There is an option for everyone usually. So we can talk about drugs being an option for everyone, but if drugs specifically are not an option for people because of financial, because of criteria, because of other factors, we then talk about what lifestyle modifications we can do for that patient. So we talk about weight maintenance, which is extremely important. We talk about exercise if the patient is able to do exercise, and talk about an exercise prescription for that patient. We talk about nutrition management supports. We talk about respiratory support. So there's always something we can do. And so we do talk about what else we can do if one drug or another aren't options.
Yes, we have to remember also that multidisciplinary care is probably the best treatment overall for ALS. It's not as sexy or promising as new drugs, but it's probably the thing that made the most change in the lives of patients with ALS over the past 20 years. So the improvement of care, respiratory, nutritional interventions are even more important.
Great. And so if we shift gears a little bit, Dr. Matt, I'll start with you. In terms of when do you first approach people with options to participate in research?
I tend to do this usually once we've sorted out the standard of care questions. And then sometimes the question will come from patients first, and we'll say, yes, you're interested, so let's look at what could we offer you. And depending on what stage of care management they're in, like we can start sometimes right away. So, and there's all types of research for all patients coming in, really.
Great. Anything to add, Dr. Shoesmith? Or
no, I think
similar?
That's a very similar response to what we would have, and I would just add that often at the very beginning, the medications to describe, so the standard of care medications are often overwhelming. So we'll say, we will discuss research at a different visit, but I have things to offer you. So there's always a little carrot. And just to touch on one of the extra points she mentioned, is that a lot of the clinical trials require a patient to be on standard care for a certain duration of time. So some trials require that person to be in a standard of care medication for 60 days, some of them are 30 days. So it depends on which medication and what duration. So we have that in the back of our mind as well as to when we have some conversations about what trials they'll be eligible for.
And actually, so jumping off that, and I'll go right back to you, Dr. Shoesmith, is there was a question around screen failures, because often people who do want to participate in certain research may end up not actually being able to in the end, and was wondering what some of the common reasons are for screen failures.
That's an excellent question and a difficult one. And one of the things I'll preempt by saying that when we have a patient in front of us in clinic, and that patient is very eager to participate in clinical trials, we tell them at the beginning that it is possible that even though we think you're a good candidate at the outset, that there's going to be something that comes up on the screening visit, so the assessment visit for the clinical trial, that will prevent them from being a candidate for the clinical trial. The most common causes for screen failure are not being able to breathe the appropriate baseline that's required for the clinical trial. So the forced vital capacity or slow vital capacity. So each trial has their own standard. Sometimes that standard is just 65%, and that person comes and try as hard as they can, they get 64%, and that is still not the standard for that clinical trial. That's often one. The others are sometimes things that we can't predict. Sometimes it's their part of their EKG interval that could be, so the heart monitoring interval that could be long. Sometimes it's just a very slight renal insufficiency or kidney problem that prevents them from being eligible as well. So we always try to hedge at the beginning to say, sometimes I don't want to put all of your hope into this trial because it's possible that we won't be able to get you in. So we always just tell them what the steps are, because we've been in that room with that disappointed patient in front of us where they've not been able to enroll into that clinical trial.
Anything to add, Dr. Matt, or should I'll move on to the next question. I think you're nodding as
Yeah,
an
I think
agreement.
our experience is very similar. We try to manage expectations from the onset and try to offer the clinical trials we think will work out for the patient so that everyone's happy. And
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to touch on, there were a number of questions around different regions of Canada, and you know, as a national organization, we got different people from around Canada who are talking about access to research in different areas. And I just thought maybe it would be great, because both of you are, as in Cal's leadership, could talk a little bit about how connected the Canadian clinical environment is, and how much, you know, you think about how to evolve equitable access across the country, and sort of how Cal's developed under that whole idea. So maybe Dr. Shoesmith, you could
Well,
maybe.
actually, okay.
You were one
No,
of the original people
because
from
I answered the
Cal's,
last
right?
question,
So I
maybe
thought.
we'll get Jean-Pierre to answer this one.
Oh, okay, sure,
sure,
perfect.
no problem. So CAL stands for the Canadian ALS Research Network. So its inception was about almost 15 years ago from the group of the leaders of different Canadian ALS clinics across the country, devoted researchers who were also clinicians. And the main goal, the main purpose is to bring clinical trials to Canadian patients and to develop the network over the country so that patients, wherever they are in our large country, can access. So we have members in virtually every province, and for different reasons, sometimes the access to resources to run clinical trials is difficult. But because we have regular meetings over the year, we meet at the CALS Research Forum. Well, we're all in the know of what's happening where, and we can best refer patients if we cannot offer trials in our center. So same here. Sometimes I find patients with genetic causes of their ALS, and oh well, Dr. Ganj and McGill has the clinical trial, so why not send her here? Or she has too many patients, why not Toronto? So that's how we try to build this. And some people will come to us and say, we'd like to join CALS. We have a fairly large ALS community in our area, so we'd like to have clinical trials. Where do I start off? And we can mentor them and bring them in the loop for everyone to have access.
And yeah, and I've seen it many times where, you know, there will be an area that doesn't have someone who is really driving ALS in that area, and the minute somebody is there or we hear about something, I know that CALS is always very excited about it, because, you know, they really care about, you know, having access of people across the country. So maybe I'll actually jump off. You had just talked about genetics, and I had actually alluded to the fact that, you know, we have a good idea that in the next while we may have some potential therapies for people with specific genetic cause of the disease. We already do actually have special access to one. I was wondering if maybe you could touch upon how you approach genetic testing with people who come to your clinic. So I'll look to you this time, Dr. Shoesmith, because we'll flip-flop it. We'll flip-flop it because you're both, yeah.
And David, thank you so much for that question. This is a challenging question because there's a lot of emotional emotionally charged responses that come with this, because families, when we're sitting in the room with them, think about, oh my goodness, I have ALS. Can I pass this on to my children? Are my siblings going to be affected? So there's definitely an emotionally charged component to it. Prior to Qalsody and the FUS treatment becoming potentially available for patients, I will say that my practice was more conservative. If there was a family history, I absolutely tested everybody who came to my clinic. So what does a family history mean? If a parent of a patient or a aunt of a patient or a sibling of a patient had ALS or frontotemporal dementia, I always did the testing. If there was no family history and nothing that would suggest that there seemed to be possibility of a family history, I generally did not do the family testing. However, now with the advent of potential treatments in the pipeline, and this is just hot off the press information because obviously this is just the end of April that the FDA approved tofersen. This is something that's going to evolve in my practice. And so there's going to be more challenging conversations, and I will test a lot of my patients, I think, that present in the clinic. But those conversations have to be preempted with, this means something if it comes back positive, and how are you going to deal with that information? How are you going to share that information? Because there's a lot of components to that. Fortunately, with tofersen, there's a treatment if you come back with a SOD1 gene or an FUS gene, and hopefully soon down the road a C9 gene. But there are several other genetic causes for ALS that do not have treatment emergent or emergent treatments within the pathway. So those are a more challenging one to have. Hopefully down the road, everything will have a treatment from a genetic perspective. But there's still some challenges with holding that information and carrying that information. My general approach to it is that if we do find a genetic mutation and it's not one that has treatment available right now, you tell those family members, well, your homework is to set a date on your calendar to check every year to see if there's a treatment available for your genetic cause of your ALS. And if there is, then maybe that would be a consideration to get tested if you haven't been tested yet, and to seek out those potential treatments. But you have to give those people reminders. And I hope that ALS Canada, I'm sure you will continue to update families through your advocacy and just your print material that you send out to make sure that all families are aware of any updates in the genetic treatment of ALS.
A great segue to us eventually working on this in a more strategic fashion. So thank you for that. Dr. Matt, anything to add?
Well, I'd say, as Dr. Shoesmith underscored, the quality of the genetic counseling is very important. Although the patient already has the disease, holding this knowledge can be in some ways harmful. So.
Okay, so thinking about that, and I know there was some discussion around potential genetic therapies that are either in clinical trial or potentially being used to treat through special access. I was wondering if, there were a lot of questions that came in, and I'm trying to summarize this, that came in around specific types of treatment and specific avenues of biology or specific types of experimental therapeutics. And I was wondering if maybe you could just quickly highlight how CALS approaches this, like that behind the scenes, there's a lot of different things that come to you. You make assessments as to, as a network, as to what particular clinical trials you might be involved in. Maybe you could just highlight a little bit about how things work in terms of clinical trials coming to Canada. So Dr. Matt, is that possible to maybe just give a little overview on?
Yes, so there are, I'd say, two ways clinical trials come to Canada. So either they will come to individual sites because they know we do well, and then we flag them, well, wait, there's just not just us in Canada, here's CALS, and we make introductions to everyone. After that, it's to the sponsor of the trial to choose which sites, and for different reasons, capacity, fixed limited resources, they will not open a site to every Canadian site interested. That's their prerogative. The other way that happens more and more and shows how CALs become important, they'll reach out to us as CALs executives for our interest as a country in a clinical trial. So we look at the data. They cannot necessarily share with us all that much info, so sometimes it's a bit blind. We have to engage further with them to get to know what we're getting into. But these are the two main ways, either through CALs or through individual sites, but we always try to bring it back to the most people in Canada possible.
And anything to add, Dr. Shoesmith, on that? So I think one of the exciting pieces there, and you can confirm or deny, but in 2023, the number of things that get talked about and considered is just so massive compared to 10 years ago or 5 years ago in terms of opportunities. And so from a hope standpoint, that's great because there's lots out there to be able to try and get involved in. So we're all ready. Oh yes, please.
Can I have a shout out to both you? So one is that Colleen Doyle does a really good job of doing a communication piece to us to show us what are updated clinical trial postings across the country, as well as research news across the world, so that we are up to date. So ALS Canada does a great job of making us informed, as well as the patient community. So that's congratulations for that. I'm also going to do a shout out to Dr. Genge. So Angela Genge is one of our members as well, and she has made Canada a go-to destination for phase 1 clinical trials. And so that's a huge nod to her and the build-up of that. But that has given us an edge over other locations because we've been able to do cutting-edge therapies at the earliest initiation point. And Dr. Matt can probably talk a little bit about her being the first one to dose for the Kerala study. But that's been a huge boost for the Canadian group as a whole.
Yeah, and obviously being in at phase 1, if something is promising, it helps to have that connection with both the company and with Health Canada moving forward for the continuation of that particular therapy. So actually in the last minute, there was a question about TDP-43 related therapies, and maybe Dr. Matt, you could just highlight that Canada was first on a therapy that is very scientifically interesting.
Thank you for that. So yeah, so Curalis is currently trying out a new drug, QRL, to want to see if we could improve statin-2 expression. So among all the things that these TDP-43 accumulations do, they reduce the level of statin-2. That's the protein that's the most modified. So with a special ASO, so gene expression modifying therapy, we're trying to increase the levels of statin-2. And this is probably one of the most rational things we've ever tried for ALS patients. And this is a solution that should apply to most forms of ALS, not only genetic ones. So it's very exciting. The first wave of patients has been enrolled. So second one coming up later this summer, if all goes well. These are very early phase therapies, so we're in the unknown. There could be dangers we're not yet aware of, and that could halt the program quickly. So it needs a lot of, we have to be very prudent, cautious about it, and thank you to the patients who are so game to get into these.
And I think that's a great point overall, and thank you both for making that, in the sense that those things I talked about in terms of scientifically exciting trials, a lot of those are actually the ones that have Canadian sites involved, and so it's a testament again to CALs getting involved into great things like that. And I think even from this particular one that was mentioned, the STATHMA-2 trial, Canada is the only site in the world, or the only country in the world that's currently recruiting for that. So another big testament to Dr. Genge, to CALS Network again. So we're already at 1 o'clock, which it always goes really fast when you do discussion panels. I will say that there were a lot of questions. We will endeavor to find a way to answer those for everyone out there, so that at least they can feel like they had a response to their question. I wanted to say a huge thank you to Dr. Shoesmith and Dr. Matt for joining today. And it's as we always say, it's an ongoing conversation always, and we're just appreciative to have great experts like you to be able to connect with for these kinds of conversations. So I might have passed back to Tammy, I think, just to say goodbye.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shoesmith and Dr. Matt. We really are very appreciative of you coming forward and being able to help respond to these questions that have come forward, and to be able to make sure that we're getting the information that people are asking for out to them. So I'd also like to thank everyone who's joined us today. We've had a very robust group behind the scenes that have been working on this. So thank you very much to the teams behind the scenes, and to all of our participants today for your thoughtful questions. We look forward to seeing you at other webinars in the future. And for now, then I ask that you go forward on June 21st, Global ALS Awareness Day. Please share your stories, because that's what helps to take us from awareness to recognition of what the realities are and what the needs are of our community, and helps to elevate so that the world has a different view as well, and we'll take action. So with that, I wish you a good afternoon.